the moment the groom saw me. His glass froze halfway to his lips. The ballroom inside the Blue Ridge Grand Hotel was glowing with soft golden light. Crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen stars above 200 smiling guests. A violin quartet played near the stage while waiters moved quietly between tables carrying champagne and silver trays of desserts. Everything about the evening looked perfect. Nathan Caldwell stood at the center of it all. He wore a sharp black tuxedo, one arm loosely around the waist of my cousin Lillian Hayes, who looked radiant in a silk gown that caught the light every time she moved. The crowd watched them with admiration as Nathan raised his champagne glass to begin his toast. "My family and I want to thank everyone who came tonight," he said confidently. "This celebration means more than we can ever explain." People laughed softly and lifted their glasses. From the back of the ballroom, I stood perfectly still. For a moment, no one noticed me. I was just another guest who had slipped in quietly after the speech began. The music played. The guests smiled. And the evening continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But then Nathan's eyes moved across the room and landed on me. The color drained from his face so quickly it looked almost unreal. His hand trembled. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. The violin music stopped. 200 people turned their heads at once, and suddenly I saw his face clearly. My heart slammed against my ribs as a memory I had spent an entire year trying to bury came rushing back. Before I could stop myself, the words tore out of my mouth loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh my God, he's mine." The room went silent. Guests looked from Nathan to me and then to the woman standing beside him. My cousin, Lillian Hayes. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. I could feel every pair of eyes in that ballroom staring directly at me, trying to understand what they had just heard. Nathan stared at me like he had seen a ghost. And in a way, maybe he had. Because 1 year ago, I was supposed to be the bride standing beside him. Instead, I was the woman everyone believed had run away from the altar. Whispers began spreading across the room. Some guests clearly recognized me. Others looked confused, trying to piece together the story they had only heard rumors about. Lillian followed Nathan's frozen gaze and finally noticed me standing near the back of the room. At first, her expression showed simple confusion. Then recognition flickered across her face. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and the warm smile she had been wearing for the crowd disappeared. Nathan's parents were sitting at a table near the front of the stage. I watched as his father leaned toward his mother, whispering something urgently. His mother's eyes darted toward me, and for the first time that evening I saw something unexpected in her expression. Fear. That reaction told me more than anything else in the room. They had spent an entire year pretending I no longer existed, and now I was standing right in front of them. Nathan slowly stepped down from the stage, his shoes clicking against the polished floor as he walked toward me. The room remained quiet except for the faint sound of people whispering behind their hands. I could feel the tension building in the air like a coming storm. Lillian stayed where she was, watching the scene unfold with growing suspicion. Nathan stopped a few feet away from me. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply stared at me like he was trying to decide if I was really there. His voice, when it finally came out, was quiet but tight with tension. "Rachel." Hearing him say my name after a year of silence felt strange, like opening a door to a life I had already closed. He glanced nervously around the ballroom, aware that every guest was watching. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the room. The elegant decorations, the smiling guests who had come expecting a perfect wedding celebration, the investors sitting at tables near the front, the Caldwell family trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping through their fingers. A year ago, this exact group of people had watched my life collapse. Most of them believed the story the Caldwell family had quietly spread afterward, that I was unstable, that I panicked, that I ran away from my own wedding the night before the ceremony. But the truth was something very different. And judging by the terrified expressions on Nathan's parents' faces, they knew it. Nathan took another cautious step toward me. "Rachel," he repeated quietly, his voice sharper this time. Why are you here? I finally met his eyes again. Because the truth about what really happened before that wedding was something his family had spent an entire year trying to bury. 1 year earlier, the house was full of flowers and laughter. The afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows of my parents' home in Savannah, Georgia, catching the white ribbons and pale roses that the wedding planner had carefully arranged along the staircase. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of celebration, boxes of decorations, garment bags hanging from doors, relatives moving through the halls with excited energy. In less than 24 hours, I was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry Nathan Caldwell. At that moment, I believed I was standing on the edge of the happiest day of my life. My aunt was in the kitchen directing caterers while my mother checked the final seating arrangements at the dining table. Bridesmaids moved in and out of the living room carrying dresses and shoes, their voices rising in cheerful conversation. My cousin Lillian Hayes stood beside me near the window, holding 2 champagne glasses. "To the future, Mrs. Caldwell," she said with a playful smile as she handed one to me. I laughed and tapped my glass against hers. "To surviving this crazy week," I replied. Lillian had been one of the people helping me most during the wedding planning. She offered advice, helped coordinate schedules, and even calmed my nerves when everything started to feel overwhelming. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Guests had already begun arriving in Savannah for the wedding weekend. Many of them were staying at the large, historic mansion the Caldwell family had rented near the riverfront for the rehearsal dinner that evening. Nathan's family was well known across North Carolina and Georgia. Their real estate development company had built luxury communities along the coast, and their business partners included investors and politicians from several states. Even during wedding planning, their business influence was impossible to ignore. Several of Nathan's father's associates had already arrived for the rehearsal dinner, and the event was beginning to feel as much like a corporate gathering as a family celebration. That afternoon, Nathan stopped by briefly to check on the schedule. He looked handsome and confident as always, wearing a navy suit and that relaxed smile that had once made me feel completely safe. He kissed my cheek and asked if everything was ready for the evening. "Almost," I said. "Are you nervous?" He chuckled softly. "A little," he admitted, "but mostly excited." For a moment, everything felt normal. But as he left the house, I noticed something strange. His parents were standing near the driveway speaking quietly with my aunt and uncle. The moment I stepped outside, their conversation stopped. Nathan's mother forced a polite smile and quickly changed the subject. I brushed off the feeling that something was off. Weddings made people tense. It was probably just stress. That evening, the rehearsal dinner was held at the mansion the Caldwell family had rented along the Savannah riverfront. The place was breathtaking. Tall columns lined the entrance, and the gardens outside were lit with strings of warm lights that reflected across the dark water of the river. Inside, the rooms were filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Everyone seemed relaxed and celebratory. But as the evening went on, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. Nathan's parents kept disappearing into private conversations with investors. My uncle spent nearly half the evening speaking with Nathan's father about project timelines and development approvals. It was strange to hear business discussions happening during what was supposed to be a family celebration. Later that night, I stepped away from the main dining room to get some fresh air. The hallway leading toward the back terrace was quiet compared to the crowded reception rooms. As I walked past Nathan's father's study, I heard voices coming from inside. At first, I assumed it was just another business conversation. But then I heard my name. I slowed down and stopped beside the door. The voices inside were clear. Nathan's father spoke first. "Lillian is the better choice," he said in a low but firm tone. My breath caught in my throat. Nathan's mother responded immediately. "She comes with the investment we need. The board will approve the project if the Hayes family backs it." Then I heard another voice. "My cousin Lillian, I understand the situation," she said calmly. "My parents are ready to commit to the partnership if everything moves forward." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Nathan's father spoke again. "The merger depends on it. If Nathan marries Rachel, The investors walk away. My heart began pounding in my chest. Nathan's mother added quietly, "We need this resolved before the ceremony." My mind struggled to process what I was hearing. My wedding, my name, and my cousin, all discussed like pieces in some kind of negotiation. The door remained slightly open, just enough for me to see shadows moving inside the room. But I didn't move closer, because in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The people inside that study weren't talking about a wedding. They were talking about a deal. And somehow, I had just discovered that I might be the one standing in the way of it. I stood outside the study door for several seconds after the voices inside fell silent. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it through the walls. "Lillian is the better choice." The words repeated in my mind again and again. For a moment I told myself I must have misunderstood something. Maybe they were discussing business in a way that had nothing to do with the wedding. But deep down I already knew that wasn't true. I stepped quietly away from the door and walked down the hallway toward the back terrace. The warm air from the river brushed against my face as I stepped outside. But it didn't calm the storm building inside my chest. Inside the mansion, the rehearsal dinner continued with music and laughter. Through the windows, I could see guests raising glasses, smiling, celebrating a wedding that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I tried to breathe slowly. Maybe Nathan didn't know about the conversation I had overheard. Maybe his parents were planning something behind his back. That thought was the only thing keeping my world from completely collapsing. But something still felt wrong. After a few minutes, I walked back into the hallway. The door to Nathan's father's study was now closed. The voices inside were gone. The corridor was empty. I told myself to walk away, but instead I reached for the door handle. It turned quietly beneath my hand. The room inside was dimly lit, with a large desk facing a window overlooking the gardens. Papers were scattered across the surface, along with several folders stamped with the Caldwell Development Company logo. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. For a moment I simply stood there, staring at the documents. This was not something I would normally do. Invading someone's office, reading their private paperwork, it felt wrong. But after what I had heard in the hallway, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something important was hidden in this room. I approached the desk slowly. One folder lay open near the edge. At the top of the first page was a title printed in bold letters: Marriage Investment Agreement. My stomach tightened. I picked up the document and began reading. The agreement described a financial partnership connected to a massive coastal development project in North Carolina. Several investors were involved. Nathan's family company would manage the construction and property development. But one section caught my attention immediately. The agreement tied certain ownership shares in the company to a strategic marital alliance between the Caldwell family and one of the investment partners. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. The marriage itself was part of the business arrangement. I turned the page. There it was, the clause that made everything suddenly make sense. If Nathan married a member of the Hayes family, the investment from that family would significantly increase their ownership stake in the development company. My hands started to tremble. The Hayes family. My family. More specifically, Lillian's parents. Another document listed projected investment contributions. Lillian's family name appeared beside a number so large it made my chest tighten. I suddenly understood the conversation I had overheard. My wedding wasn't just a wedding. It was leverage. If Nathan married me, the investment deal might collapse. But if he married my cousin instead, the project would move forward. The realization felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I closed the folder slowly, trying to steady my breathing. Memories from the past year rushed through my mind. Nathan canceling dinners because of sudden business meetings. His parents constantly asking questions about my family's finances. Small arguments about guest lists and family seating arrangements. At the time, they had seemed like normal wedding stress. Now they looked like pieces of a plan I had never been meant to understand. I placed the folder back on the desk and walked out of the study. The hallway felt colder than before. I found Lillian standing near the garden doors, scrolling through her phone while the music from the rehearsal dinner played softly behind her. When she saw my face, She frowned slightly. Rachel, are you okay? I walked straight toward her. You knew, I said quietly. Her expression shifted for just a moment. What are you talking about? The investment deal, I said. The one tied to Nathan's marriage. For a few seconds she didn't speak. Then her shoulders relaxed, and the friendly smile she had been wearing all evening disappeared. So you heard, she said calmly. The casual tone of her voice made my chest ache. You've been planning this? I asked. My parents have been negotiating with the Caldwells for months, she replied. This development project is huge. And you never thought to tell me, I said. Lillian shrugged. You were never really the right bride for that family. The words hit harder than I expected. I stared at her, searching for any sign that she felt even a little guilty. But there was nothing. Just quiet confidence. I turned away without saying another word. Inside the mansion, the rehearsal dinner continued with laughter and music. But for me, the celebration was already over. Later that night, I packed a small suitcase in my bedroom. My wedding dress still hung in the closet, untouched. For a long time, I stood there looking at it. Then I closed the closet door. Before leaving, I opened my laptop and typed a short email to a lawyer I had met months earlier through a nonprofit housing project. I attached the photo I had secretly taken of the contract. Then I sent the message. Just before sunrise, I drove out of Savannah. My phone filled with missed calls as relatives woke up and realized I was gone. I turned the phone off and kept driving. Everyone would believe I had run away from my own wedding. And maybe that was easier than the truth. But one day, the truth behind that contract would come back. The morning of the wedding, Savannah woke up without a bride. I was already miles away by the time the sun rose over the river. My phone had begun vibrating nonstop an hour after I left the city. First, my mother. Then my aunt. Then Nathan. Soon the screen was filled with missed calls and messages. Where are you? Rachel, please call me. The ceremony starts in 4 hours. I turned the phone off and left it on the passenger seat. The road stretched out ahead of me, quiet and empty. And for the first time since overhearing that conversation the night before, I could finally breathe. By the time the ceremony was supposed to begin, I had crossed the state line. Later, I would learn how the story unfolded behind me. Guests arrived at the church expecting a wedding. Instead, they found confusion. The bride was gone. No explanation. No note except the short message I had left for my parents saying I needed time away. Within hours, the rumors began spreading. Some people said I had panicked. Others said I discovered something about Nathan and ran away. Nathan's family said very little. But they did nothing to correct the story that slowly formed. Rachel Monroe ran away from the altar. The bride lost her nerve. The wedding collapsed. And with time, that version of events became the official truth. It was easier for everyone that way. I didn't go back to Savannah. Instead, I kept driving west until the city I had grown up in disappeared completely behind me. 3 days later, I arrived in Houston, Texas. A nonprofit organization I had volunteered with during college was helping coordinate housing repairs after a major hurricane had devastated parts of the Gulf Coast. When I contacted them asking if they needed help, they didn't ask many questions. They just gave me an address and told me to show up Monday morning. The work was exhausting. Most days I spent hours walking through damaged neighborhoods with contractors and volunteers, helping families rebuild homes that had been flooded or destroyed by storms. There were days when we carried debris out of houses until our arms shook from exhaustion. Other days, we sat with families who had lost everything and helped them apply for emergency housing grants. Compared to what those families were facing, my own heartbreak felt smaller. Not gone, but smaller. At night, when the city quieted down, the memories still came back. The rehearsal dinner, the contract, Lillian's calm voice telling me I had never been the right bride. But during the day, the work kept my mind focused on something other than the past. Months passed. I avoided social media and rarely contacted anyone from Savannah. The silence between me and my old life became almost comfortable. Then one afternoon, nearly 8 months after I left Georgia, My phone rang while I was reviewing repair estimates in a temporary office trailer. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. But something made me answer. "Rachel Monroe?" a calm voice asked. "Yes. My name is Daniel Brooks. You emailed me last year regarding a document connected to the Caldwell Development Company." For a moment, I didn't respond. I had almost forgotten about the email I sent the night I left Savannah. The photograph of the contract. "I remember," I said carefully. "I reviewed the materials you provided," he continued. "And I believe there may be serious legal concerns connected to that agreement." My chest tightened. "What kind of concerns?" "The document links corporate share distribution to a marriage arrangement," he explained. "Depending on how it was structured, that could violate certain investment regulations." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the office wall. "I'm not involved with that family anymore," I said quietly. "I understand," he replied. "But there is another issue you should be aware of." I waited. "The agreement appears to assume that your engagement to Nathan Caldwell was part of the original investment structure," he said. "That engagement never legally ended within the contract framework." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the partnership terms could be unstable if Mr. Caldwell marries someone else without formally resolving the original agreement." The words settled slowly in my mind. Nathan marrying someone else. The idea didn't surprise me as much as it should have. "What makes you think that's going to happen?" I asked. There was a short pause on the line. "Because the Caldwell family has announced an upcoming wedding," he said. My stomach tightened. "A wedding?" "Yes," he replied. "Nathan Caldwell and Lillian Hayes. The event is scheduled to take place in Asheville, North Carolina." For a moment I couldn't speak. After everything that had happened, they had simply moved forward, rewritten the story, built a new one without me. "The celebration is expected to include several investors connected to the development project," Daniel Brooks continued, "which means the business partnership may also be finalized during the event." I stared out the window of the trailer at the construction crews working in the distance. For nearly a year I had tried to forget everything about the Caldwells. But suddenly the past was reaching into my life again. "I'm not interested in reopening that chapter," I said finally. "I understand," the lawyer replied. "But if the agreement you discovered is still active, the situation may not be as simple as they believe." After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. That night I opened my laptop and searched the announcement he had mentioned. There it was. Nathan Caldwell and Lillian Hayes. Wedding reception. Blue Ridge Grand Hotel, Asheville, North Carolina. A perfect celebration. I stared at the screen, feeling something stir inside me that I had spent months trying to bury. For almost a year I had been running from the past. But now the past was standing directly in front of me again. And something about that contract still didn't feel finished. For several days after the lawyer's call, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. Life in Houston continued the same way it always had. Every morning I arrived at the recovery office before 8, checked repair schedules, and drove out to damaged neighborhoods where families were still rebuilding their homes months after the storms. On the surface, everything felt normal, but something in the back of my mind refused to stay quiet. The lawyer's words kept returning. The agreement was never formally resolved. Nathan Caldwell and Lillian Hayes. Wedding reception in Asheville. I told myself it had nothing to do with me anymore. Whatever business arrangement the Caldwell family was planning, it was their problem. I had already walked away. But the feeling wouldn't disappear. Late one afternoon, I returned to my apartment after a long day of inspections. The Texas heat still clung to the air as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. A large envelope was sitting in front of my door. At first, I assumed it was just another bill or work document. But the envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with a small gold sticker. My name was written neatly across the front. Rachel Monroe. There was no return address. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For several seconds, I just stared at it. Something about the elegant design made my stomach tighten. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a formal wedding invitation. The heavy paper unfolded slowly in my hands. Nathan Caldwell and Lillian Hayes request the honor of your presence at their wedding reception. Blue Ridge Grand Hotel, Asheville, North Carolina. The words blurred slightly as I read them. For a moment I thought it must have been sent by mistake. But then a smaller card slipped from the envelope. It was handwritten. Rachel, family is still family. No matter what happened last year, we hope you'll come celebrate this new beginning with us. Aunt Margaret. I read the note twice. The message sounded polite, but something about it felt wrong. A new beginning. As if the past had simply been erased. As if the year before had never happened. I leaned back against the chair, holding the invitation in my hands. Memories I had pushed away came rushing back. The church filled with guests waiting for a bride who never arrived. The rumors spreading through Savannah that I had panicked and run away. Friends who stopped calling. Relatives who avoided asking questions because the answers were uncomfortable. The Caldwell family had never corrected the story. And why would they? It made them look like victims of a dramatic runaway bride. It protected their reputation. I placed the invitation back on the table. The elegant gold letters seemed to stare up at me. A perfect wedding celebration. As if the original one had never existed. My phone rang suddenly, breaking the silence. The caller ID showed my younger brother's name. Ethan. I answered after the second ring. Hey, he said. Hey. There was a brief pause. So, you got the invitation? Didn't you? I glanced at the envelope on the table. Yeah. He sighed quietly. The whole town's talking about the wedding, he said. It's not just a wedding, Rachel. It's basically a business announcement. What do you mean? Investors. Politicians. Developers? Ethan explained. The Caldwell family is turning the reception into a huge event. They're announcing some coastal development project. The words made my chest tighten. The same project mentioned in the contract. They're expecting a lot of important people there, he continued. I remained silent for a moment. Are you going? He asked. I don't know. You should, Ethan said immediately. I frowned slightly. Why? Because everyone still believes the same story, he replied. That you ran away. I looked down at the invitation again. Maybe it's better if they keep believing that. No, Ethan said firmly. It's not. His voice softened a little. You didn't do anything wrong, Rachel. The words settled quietly in the room. I'm not sure showing up would fix anything, I said. Maybe not, he replied. But if you stay away, they get to keep pretending their version of the story is the only one that exists. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The invitation remained in front of me. A perfect celebration. A perfect new beginning. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found another number. Daniel Brooks. The lawyer answered after a few rings. I received the invitation. I told him. I expected you might, he said calmly. If I go, I asked. What happens? That depends, he replied. But sometimes the truth doesn't require confrontation. What do you mean? Sometimes simply showing up is enough to disrupt a carefully managed narrative. After the call ended, the apartment fell silent again. I looked at the invitation one more time. For almost a year I had convinced myself that leaving Savannah was the strongest decision I could make. But maybe strength wasn't only about walking away. Maybe sometimes it meant coming back. That night I opened my laptop and booked a flight to North Carolina. I didn't tell most of my family. Only Ethan and the lawyer knew. When I finished packing a small suitcase, I slipped the invitation into the front pocket. Because in a few days, I would be standing inside that reception, and the past the Caldwell family had spent a year rewriting would finally walk back into the room. The Blue Ridge Grand Hotel looked even more extravagant than the photos I had seen online. Luxury cars filled the curved driveway outside the entrance, and uniformed valets moved quickly between arriving guests. Soft golden lights illuminated the tall glass doors, and a string quartet played near the entrance as people stepped out of black sedans in elegant evening clothes. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching the celebration from a distance. 1 year ago, I had driven away from Savannah before sunrise, leaving everything behind. Now I was standing outside another wedding connected to the same man. But this time I wasn't running. I crossed the street and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the hotel lobby buzzed with quiet excitement. Guests in formal attire moved toward the grand ballroom while waiters carried trays of champagne through the crowd. No one stopped me. No one questioned why I was there. To them, I was just another guest attending an elegant reception. The ballroom doors stood open at the end of a long hallway. Warm music drifted out into the corridor. I stepped inside. The room was enormous, lit by towering chandeliers that reflected across polished marble floors. Round tables covered in white linen filled the space, each decorated with roses and tall glass candle holders. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Investors, business partners, family members, people who had come expecting a perfect wedding celebration. At the front of the ballroom, a small stage had been set up with microphones and a long table draped in dark velvet. Nathan Caldwell stood there beside my cousin Lillian Hayes. For a moment, I simply watched them. Nathan looked exactly the same as I remembered. Confident posture, relaxed smile. The same calm presence that once made me believe he would never hurt me. Lillian stood close to him in a bright white gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Together, they looked like the perfect couple. The kind of couple people admired. The kind of couple whose story sounded simple and romantic. I moved quietly toward the back of the room, blending into the crowd. Nathan was in the middle of a speech. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said into the microphone. "Your support means everything to our families and to the future we're building together." Polite applause filled the room. As he spoke, several investors seated near the front nodded approvingly. Nathan's father sat at a nearby table beside a group of business partners, watching the stage with satisfaction. Everything was unfolding exactly the way the Caldwell family had planned, until Nathan's eyes moved across the room and landed on me. The change in his expression happened instantly. His smile vanished. His voice stopped mid-sentence. For a long second, he didn't move at all. Then the champagne glass in his hand slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor and shattered. The sharp sound echoed through the ballroom. The musicians stopped playing. Guests turned toward the stage in confusion. Nathan stared directly at me. The color drained from his face. Whispers began spreading through the crowd as people followed his gaze. Some of them recognized me immediately. Others simply sensed that something was wrong. Lillian frowned and turned toward the back of the room. Her eyes found me standing among the guests. At first, she looked confused. Then recognition flickered across her face. Her expression hardened. Across the ballroom, Nathan's parents noticed the commotion. His father stood abruptly from his chair. His mother turned toward me with wide eyes. For the first time since I entered the room, I saw genuine fear on their faces. A few guests began whispering loudly enough for others to hear. "That's her, the bride who disappeared." She came back. Nathan slowly stepped away from the microphone. The entire ballroom had fallen silent. Every person in the room was now watching us. He descended from the stage carefully, as if he wasn't sure the floor beneath him was real. I felt my heart pounding, but my voice came out steady when I spoke. "Oh my God." The words escaped before I could stop them. "He's mine." The sentence echoed across the silent room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several guests stood from their chairs. Lillian stepped forward from the stage, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. Nathan's uncle moved quickly through the crowd toward me. "Miss Monroe," he said quietly, forcing a polite smile. "Perhaps we should step outside and talk privately." I shook my head. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." His smile disappeared. Across the room, Nathan reached the floor and began walking toward me. Lillian watched him carefully, her posture tense. Nathan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at me like he was trying to understand how I could possibly be standing in front of him again. "Rachel," he said finally. His voice was low and strained. "Why are you here?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, my eyes moved past him toward the front of the ballroom, near the stage. A long table had been arranged with several thick folders and legal documents neatly stacked beside silver pens. Nathan's father and a group of investors were standing nearby, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Then I noticed someone else standing among the guests. Daniel Brooks. The lawyer gave me a small nod from across the room. In that moment, I understood exactly what was about to happen. The wedding celebration wasn't just about marriage. It was about finalizing the deal tied to that contract. And the entire plan depended on one thing: that the past stayed buried. Nathan took another step toward me. "Rachel," he said again, his voice sharper this time. "Answer me. Why are you here?" I looked back at him, because if he signed those documents tonight, the truth would disappear forever. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Nathan stood a few feet in front of me, his expression somewhere between panic and disbelief. The entire ballroom was silent. Every guest in the room was watching us. "Rachel?" he said again, his voice tight. "Why are you here?" For a moment I didn't answer. I could feel the weight of 100 conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors for the past year pressing down on the room. The runaway bride, the broken wedding, the quiet replacement, Nathan's perfect new beginning. All of it built on a story that was only half true. I took a slow breath and stepped forward so everyone could hear me clearly. "Oh my God," I said, my voice steady. "He's mine." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Several people gasped. Others began whispering loudly, trying to understand what they had just heard. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Rachel," he said sharply, lowering his voice, "this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I replied. Behind him, Lillian had stepped down from the stage. Her white dress moved across the floor as she approached us, her expression hard and suspicious. "What is she talking about?" she demanded. Nathan didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. Lillian's eyes moved from his face to mine. "You'd better explain," she said. I met her gaze calmly. "1 year ago," I said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Nathan Caldwell and I signed a legal agreement tied to his family's development company." The whispering grew louder. Nathan's father stood abruptly from his table. "That's enough," he said sharply. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. The agreement connected his marriage to a financial investment. I continued. And that agreement was never formally resolved. Lillian stared at Nathan. "What is she talking about?" Nathan looked trapped. Before he could answer, another voice spoke from behind the crowd. "She's telling the truth." Daniel Brooks stepped forward. The room shifted as guests turned to look at him. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he said calmly. "I'm a corporate attorney." Nathan's father moved quickly toward him. "You have no right to be here." "I was invited," Daniel replied evenly, "and several investors here asked me to review the partnership agreement connected to the Caldwell development project." At the word investors, several men near the front of the room leaned closer, listening carefully. Daniel continued. "The original agreement connected the investment structure of the project to a marriage alliance involving Mr. Caldwell." He glanced toward me briefly. "That alliance originally involved Rachel Monroe." A murmur spread across the ballroom. Nathan's father's face darkened. "This is completely irrelevant." "Is it?" Daniel replied calmly. He gestured toward the table near the stage where the legal documents were waiting. "If Mr. Caldwell signs the partnership transfer tonight, while the original agreement remains unresolved, it could invalidate the entire investment structure." The investors began whispering urgently among themselves. Nathan's father looked furious. "You're trying to sabotage this family." "No," Daniel said quietly. "I'm explaining the legal risk." Lillian turned slowly toward Nathan. "Is this true?" Nathan rubbed his forehead, clearly overwhelmed. "Lillian, answer me," she said. The room had gone completely still again. Finally, Nathan spoke. "My parents believed the project needed the Hayes family investment," he said quietly. "That's not what I asked," Lillian replied. His voice dropped. They thought the partnership would be stronger if I married you. The words hung in the air. Lillian's face changed. You replaced Rachel because of money. Nathan looked miserable. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. A bitter laugh escaped from someone in the crowd. Across the ballroom, investors began making phone calls. Nathan's father stepped forward angrily. This conversation is over. But the damage had already been done. The perfect wedding celebration was unraveling in front of everyone. Lillian slowly removed her hand from Nathan's arm. So that's what this is, she said quietly. Nathan reached toward her. Lillian, listen. She stepped back. If my family hadn't invested in your company, she said slowly, would you still be standing here marrying me? Nathan didn't answer. He couldn't. That silence was louder than anything else said that night. Lillian stared at him for several seconds. Then she slipped the ring from her finger. The diamond caught the chandelier light as she placed it on the table beside the unsigned documents. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. Guests stepped aside to let her pass. The room erupted into dozens of overlapping conversations. Investors were leaving their tables. Nathan's parents were arguing with lawyers. The carefully planned celebration had collapsed. Nathan stood in the center of the chaos, looking completely lost. Finally, he turned back to me. Rachel, he said quietly. His voice sounded nothing like the confident man who had stood on that stage earlier. I never expected you to come back. I looked around the room. The music had stopped. The celebration was over. The truth had finally come out. Nathan took a slow step closer. What do you want now? He asked. For a moment I didn't answer. Because standing there in the middle of the ruined reception, I realized something unexpected. After everything that had happened, revenge wasn't what I had come back for. The ballroom no longer looked like a wedding. The music had stopped completely, leaving behind a strange quiet filled only with nervous conversations and the occasional clink of glasses being set down on tables. Guests who had been smiling minutes earlier were now standing in tense groups, whispering while checking their phones. Several investors were already heading toward the exit. Nathan's father was arguing with two men in dark suits near the stage, his voice low but sharp. One of the investors shook his head and walked away before the conversation was even finished. The elegant celebration the Caldwell family had spent months planning was falling apart piece by piece. And all of it had happened in less than 15 minutes. Nathan still stood in front of me, looking like a man who had just watched his entire life tilt off balance. Around us, the ballroom continued buzzing with tension. But for a moment, the noise faded into the background. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. I didn't think you'd ever come back, he said quietly. His voice sounded different now, less confident, less certain. I looked past him toward the stage where the legal documents still sat untouched on the velvet-covered table. The silver pens beside them reflected the chandelier light, waiting for signatures that were never going to happen. I didn't come back for revenge, I said. Nathan frowned slightly. Then why? Before I answered, a familiar voice spoke behind us. She deserves to know the truth. Lillian had returned. Several guests stepped aside as she walked back into the ballroom. Her hair was slightly disheveled now, and the confident smile she had worn earlier that evening was gone. But her expression was steady, stronger than I expected. She stopped beside us and looked directly at Nathan. For once in your life, she said quietly, don't lie. Nathan looked from her to me. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally, he nodded slowly. My parents believed the company needed the Hayes investment to secure the coastal development project, he admitted. Lillian crossed her arms. And the easiest way to guarantee that investment was marriage. Nathan didn't argue. That's why they pushed me to replace Rachel, he said. The words hung heavy in the air. Lillian let out a quiet laugh that held no amusement at all. So I wasn't the better bride, she said softly. I was the better business deal. Nathan tried to respond, but the words never came. For the first time that night, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. Lillian slowly removed the ring from her finger again. This time she didn't hesitate. She walked to the stage and placed the ring beside the unsigned legal documents. Then she turned back toward Nathan. "You should have told the truth a year ago," she said. Without waiting for an answer, she walked out of the ballroom again. No one tried to stop her. Nathan watched her leave. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he turned back toward me. "I'm sorry," he said. The apology sounded genuine, but it came a year too late. "I believed my parents when they said everything would work out," he continued. "I thought the contract could be fixed later. You didn't think about what it would do to me," I said quietly. He looked down. "No," he admitted. The honesty in that single word said more than anything else he could have explained. I glanced around the ballroom. Guests were still leaving. The Caldwell family's lawyers were now speaking urgently with several investors. The celebration had officially turned into a crisis. Nathan looked back at me. "Is there any chance we could fix this?" he asked. For a moment, I remembered the life we had once planned together. The house we talked about buying. The future that had seemed so certain. But that life belonged to a different version of Nathan. A version that had disappeared the night his family decided a better bride existed. I shook my head gently. "No." The word felt calm. "Certain." "I didn't come back to rebuild the past," I said. "I came back so the truth wouldn't stay buried." Nathan nodded slowly. "I understand." Outside the ballroom doors, the cool mountain air felt refreshing after the tension inside. I stepped onto the hotel terrace and looked out across the quiet Asheville skyline. For the first time in a year, my chest felt lighter. The humiliation. The rumors. The silence. They didn't control my story anymore. Inside the ballroom, the Caldwell family's carefully constructed image was collapsing under its own weight. But strangely, I didn't feel the satisfaction I once imagined revenge might bring. Instead, I felt something better. Peace. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as revenge. Sometimes it arrives as the truth finally being spoken out loud. A few days later, I was back in Texas. The rebuilding work continued. Families still needed homes repaired. Communities still needed help. Life moved forward. And for the first time since that night in Savannah, I felt ready to move forward with it. Because the past no longer had power over me. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destroying someone who hurt you. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let their betrayal define who you become. If you've ever experienced betrayal like this, especially from people who were supposed to be family, I'd really like to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your experience might help someone else who feels like they're going through it alone right now. And if stories about justice, family drama, and finding strength after betrayal resonate with you, make sure you stay here with us and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this coming. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is tell the truth.